Right. Hello, my name is John Peter Antonacci, and I'm a fourth-year PhD student here at SUNY Binghamton's Department of Sociology. It's an incredible honor, and I'm very excited to be presenting here at the Immanuel Wallerstein Memorial Graduate Student Speaker Series to my wonderful colleagues here at SUNY Binghamton and to those joining us virtually. And thank you to the organizers for putting this together. This is really great. So today I'd like to propose a thesis that locates the 7 Years' War, which was fought between 1756 and 1763, as a turning point in the history of capitalism. I'll argue that the 7 Years' War, particularly in the North American theater, was a moment of intensification of two interrelated processes that would come to shape North America's position in the capitalist world system and capitalist world ecology. The war unleashed processes of one, proletarianization, and two, agro-industrialization, never before seen at this scale in North America. These two processes of proletarianization and agro-industrialization, as we will see, mutually constituted one another. So Philip McMichael in Food Regimes and Agrarian Questions historicizes the first modern British-centric food regime to the decades after 1870. In this moment, British capital, needing places to be invested following the crisis of profitability of the 1870s, is poured into the construction of railroads in the American West, making American wheat, very cheap wheat, accessible for sale on a global scale. But this British wheat-centered food regime did not spring forth overnight after 1870. The process of cultivating wheat and turning the American West into a global breadbasket took time. Where then, in space and time, are we to locate the origins of American wheat cultivation? Likewise, Brian Page and Richard Walker, in their article From Settlement to Fordism, the Agro-Industrial Revolution in the American Midwest, they aim to uncover the processes that made American industry develop in the Midwest. They argue that the proliferation of small family farms drove industrialization, that the need to produce commodities to support the family farm implements, tanning, brewing, milling, and a bunch of other industries grew up alongside the growth of agriculture in the Midwest. Periodizing the origins of this process to the 1840s, they argue that, quote, the American road to capitalism ran through the family farm. But where and when do we mark the beginning of this process of settlement of the American West by Anglo-American farmers? What processes and what relations drove this settlement and development of agriculture west of the Appalachians? How we answer these questions shapes our understanding of the developmental processes that made American capitalism. To locate the origins of Western American agriculture and of the development of Midwestern American industry to the 7 Years' War, as I aim to do here, tells us a story in which militarization and environmental change taken together, both driven by the wartime actions of the British imperial state, made possible and were made possible by the conquest and development of the American West. But first, just a brief refresher on the 7 Years' War. So it was fought between 1756 and 1763. It could be argued it was the first global war in history, modern history. Winston Churchill famously remarked that the conflict represented the First World War. Historian Fred Anderson considers the war to be, quote, the most important event to occur in 18th century North America, not the American Revolution. Beginning in 1754, when a young George Washington unsuccessfully led troops from colonial Virginia to contest French claims to the Ohio River Valley, the conflict would come to engulf much of the world. Fighting took place from the North American continent to India, from Europe to Africa, and the West Indies. Every major European power would be brought into the fighting, each with their own goals of acquiring new territory. Some territorial ambitions limited to Europe, and some with an eye to global conquest. An alliance of Britain and Prussia would face off against Austria, Russia, and France, with Spain joining the war on the side of France later. We could talk about each empire's goals in the wars later, but they're complicated, so I don't have time to discuss them all here. But so outside of Europe, France and Spain battled Britain for control of American colonies in the Caribbean and in North America. In India, Britain and France fought over trading rights, as well as control over certain important European settlements, such as Bengal and Pondicherry. The French and British also raided their opponents' trading posts in West Africa. The outcomes of the conflict were multiple. So Prussia and Russia would emerge as new Eastern powers, adding complexity to the delicate balance of power set up in Europe following the 30 Years' War and the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. France's colonial empire in North America and India were virtually annihilated and absorbed by Britain. Prussia retained Silesia. Austria's war-making capacity was shattered, and warming relations between Prussia and Russia would allow for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to be partitioned through the 1770s. So scholars have noted that the ways that the social, political, and financial, but crucially not environmental burdens of war would help set the stage for the American War of Independence, the French Revolution, and the ascent of Great Britain to global imperial hegemony. But this 7 Years' War, it took place in the context of an evolving capitalist world system in which North America was gradually becoming more important to European powers. The fighting broke out in North America in 1754 over competing British and French territorial claims to the Ohio River Valley. At stake was geopolitical influence on the continent, itself a struggle over controls of webs of life. For the French, the fertile soils of the Ohio and Shenandoah valleys, as well as Canada, could be exploited to grow cheap food, to be sent back to France, and to feed their slave populations in the Caribbean colonies, enabling them to devote colonial production to the export of cash crops. The British, for their part, saw North America as a vital market for their industrially produced commodities. As the British colonial population grew from roughly 250,000 in 1700 to 1.2 million by 1750, historian Daniel Baugh notes that, quote, at mid-century, when it came to be realized that North American colonists were purchasing vast quantities of British manufactured goods and that the trade fostered a large shipping traffic, influential members of the public began to think that settlement in North America ought to be allowed to expand. So fighting this war in North America in the middle of the 18th century was difficult, especially for large organized European armies. Here's a moment in which environment shaped war. Unlike in Europe, there were no large open fields to fight battles in, very few fortified cities to siege and defend, and few roads and navigable rivers to transport large quantities of troops and materials. So battles typically centered on control of forts. You can see there's a string of forts constructed by the British here in this image. Forts like Fort Pitt, which becomes the city of Pittsburgh later on. And typically these forts were located at the confluence of rivers. So there were many battles fought on the Susquehanna River, right in our backyard. So the careful management of logistics would be required to win a war under these difficult conditions for European armies. So beginning in 1758, the British, who took as a key strategic goal of the war the stripping of France's colonial possessions in North America, began to implement a strategy they called administration against the wilderness. In order to win the war, they needed to not only control French territory, they needed to control webs of life themselves. So in undertaking this effort, the 7 Years' War would reshape the North American landscape. States at war would need to produce the very environments that they would fight in. But doing so required a massive influx of cheap labor. So for large, organized European armies with their massive numbers of troops and huge logistical baggage trains to move and fight effectively, roads and fortifications would need to be constructed where they had never existed before. And soldiers would provide the labor to do so. Military service represented a key vector of class formation, proletarianization, in 18th century North America. A number of conditions in the British colonies drove men into military service in droves. First, we've already noted that the population of British North America grew by 1 million over 50 years from 1700 to 1750. Many of these people were migrants, recently dispossessed peasants from Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and other places, fleeing intense exploitation, famine, disease, war, and the effects of the Little Ice Age in the long, cold 17th century. This increase in population was a catalyst for colonial expansion. The desire for cheap land west of the Appalachian Mountains was tantalizing and led to some of these conflicts between British and French settlers and with indigenous Americans, like in the Ohio River Valley in 1754, which was the flashpoint for the start of the 7 Years' War. At the same time, the British economy was undergoing transformation. Early industrialization meant that American markets were becoming flooded with British commodities. This generated a crisis in American petty craft production. So labor historian Peter Way notes that, quote, skilled craftsmen, including but not limited to weavers, tailors, and shoemakers, experienced a loss of control of their means of production. Various trades were feeling the early effects of the Industrial Revolution with new technologies and the alteration of social relations of production causing massive unemployment in North America. So large numbers of dispossessed peasants and craftsmen now needed work, and the British military now needed an influx of soldiers. So these men enter service in droves, and in doing so, enter the wage relation for the first time. So from 1754, just to give you a bit of sense of scale, from 1754 to 1761, the size of the professional British Army in North America grew from approximately 3,000 troops to 25,000. But these figures don't take into account the numbers of provincial troops. So provincial troops are troops raised by the colonies themselves. So tens of thousands of provincial troops would fight in the war, In 1758, 22,500 provincials were mustered. In 1759, New England, New York, and New Jersey alone fielded 17,000 troops, and in 1760, another 15,000. Fred Anderson, that historian, argues about New England as a whole through the war that, quote, between 40 and 60% of men in their prime military age would pass through the provincial forces before peace returned. So this is happening on a pretty big scale. So these British soldiers during the 7 Years' War would be paid by the British state for their participation in combat. They would receive a wage, but they also undertook what Peter Way calls civil labor. So this is working to lay roads, construct fort, clear ground, pilot boats used to navigate rivers. So here's a figure here. It's showing the construction of a road by General Braddock's army outside of present-day Pittsburgh. And it illustrates the interconnectedness of civil work and soldiering. So it's pretty hard to see, but it says here workers, and then they're protected on all sides by troop formations, but the workers are also soldiers. So for these roads, which were constructed by British colonial court order and paid for by the British state, not only allowed for the movements of troops, but also, according to historian Warren Hofstra, quote, define the rights and ways that allowed people to move across the landscape of private property, thereby giving meaning to individual ownership of property by creating the potential for economic development. Soldiers played this central role in laboring to produce the North American environment as one favorable to accumulation. Commodities could be moved up and down these roads to deploy the geopower of the British state to build the infrastructure through which Christian Parenti highlights as essential to the delivery of cheap natures to capital. So the story of the 7 Years' War's role in the transformation of labor relations in North America is intimately tied to the story of the development of capitalist agriculture on the continent. The massive influx of proletarians as soldiers to the frontiers of the British colonies played an important role in the commercialization of agriculture beyond the Appalachian. So soldiers with cash in hand from their wages needed to be fed, and British forces relied on local food production to meet their caloric needs. For a single fort like Fort Pitt to operate, 5,000 pounds of food a month was required every month for 7 years. So grain, vegetables, livestock, alcohol, but also things like clothing and medical services were all required and supplied by Virginia settlers and all paid for by the British state. So wheat was central both to the British Army and of course US industrial and economic history, as Adam noted earlier. There was a British General Braddock. His quartermaster remarked that, quote, flour was as essential to the British Army as gunpowder, end quote. This cultivation of wheat would become a primary staple export of the valley, and it quickly became one of the most dynamic aspects of the region's commerce, providing farmers with a source of profit and, of course, linking them to the Atlantic economy. The links between the Atlantic world economy and British colonial backcountry agriculture developed in a context in which, following Hofstra, quote, the European economy was transformed by dramatic increases in population, the beginning stages of the Industrial Revolution, the declining capacity of European agriculture to supply the growing needs of a dependent population, and the consequent worldwide rise in the price of food, especially grains. So New World grain would prove much cheaper, owing to the near absent cost of land, a rising body of proletarian labor, wartime demand, and as we've seen, improvements in transportation, roads, canals. So taken together, this results in the fact that by 1760, flour prices in Atlantic ports were sufficient for the first time to offset transportation costs from inland areas, which allowed backcountry farmers to profit from the flour they had long produced for local exchange. So if European agriculture couldn't provide sufficiently cheap food to a burgeoning proletarian population in England, neither could the British colonies on the east coast of North America, who were by the late 18th century facing a crisis of soil fertility engendered by farming practices in use by European farmers since the early 17th century. So this fertile land in Virginia, Ohio, Illinois, it beckons. What was needed was what we might think of as a metabolic shift, a geographical reconfiguration of patterns of power, profit, and plow, one oriented west. Declining soil fertility in England and on the eastern seaboard can be understood as an instance of a cyclical phenomenon in capitalist agriculture, in which, and this is following Jason W. Moore, in successive eras of agricultural development, yield growth reaches a ceiling beyond which new gains are increasingly modest. This threatens to undermine labor productivity and increase reproduction costs for labor power, end quote. Right, so a decline in labor productivity and a rise in the reproduction costs of labor power was precisely what English capital needed to avoid in the middle of the 18th century as industrial manufacturing starts accelerating. So as such, again, following more, the British in the long 19th century dealt with stagnant agricultural productivity growth, which was in motion from the 1760s, in part through a phosphate acquisition strategy, so finding guano, but also by outsourcing food production to the Americas. So if declining soil fertility threatened the profitability of an expanding British manufacturing economy, the geographical expansion of British capitalism worked to counter this threat. Bound up in these processes of geographical expansion, as we have seen, was a growing proletarian population on the continent, the development of industry infrastructure such as the construction of forts, roads, bridges, canals, and the stimulation of North American agriculture, all paid for and made possible by the needs of the British war-making as an environment-making state fighting the 7 Years' War in North America. So wheat cultivation, I'm on the right side, sorry. So wheat cultivation as a source of profit coupled with these changes in the world economy would drive Americans west. So there was this American land speculator, he was a statesman, he was an army officer, and a capitalist planter, when writing to an indebted friend from the Virginia Colonial Regiment, offered advice how to avoid economic ruin. And this advice sort of captures the opportunity the West offered to aspiring capitalists and serves as the title, some part of this quote serves as the title for the article upon which this talk is based. This statesman, he writes, quote, "There is a large field before you, an opening prospect in the back country for adventurers, where numbers resort to, and where an enterprising man with very little money may lay the foundations of a noble estate." You might know the man who penned that quote as George Washington, the first president of the United States. So here we can locate the origin of the farms Page and Walker highlight as essential to the development of American agriculture. We can locate the origins of the American road to capitalism, which passed directly through the family farm, to westward expansion and the intensification of farming past the Appalachian Mountains, made possible by the expulsion of French from North America during the 7 Years' War. In other words, the American road to capitalism may have passed directly through the family farm, but the road itself was built to move troops to the frontiers of empire in the 18th century. So just to conclude, the history of North America, I'm sure Adam would probably agree with me, the history of North America's transition from periphery to core of the hegemonic zone of the capitalist world system is in large part the story of the interplay between cheap labor and cheap food. From providing Great Britain with cheap grain to feed this burgeoning second industrial revolution in the long 19th century, to exporting this food globally as a weapon in the worldwide war against communism in the long 20th century, the American story turns on the conquest of a continent in the service of capital. Locating the origins of these processes and naming the relations that drive them is, I think, incredibly important. Here, I've proposed to highlight the role of the British imperial state as a prime mover in the development of early American agriculture and the formation of an early American working class. Here, Wallerstein's state that produces the conditions of accumulation, Charles Tilley's war-making state, and Christian Parenti's environment-making state here are bound historically and joined dialectically. This period, 1756 through 1763, is a moment in which war and environmental change drive a large proletarian population into the servitude of capital on an opening westward great frontier. The ensuing windfall profits would prove immense. So too would the exploitation of proletarians, indigenous Americans, and of environments. Thank you.